Good morning, everyone. My name is Winnie Stackelberg, and I'm Executive Vice President of External Affairs here at the Center for American Progress. On behalf of everyone here at CAP and our great partners at Generation Citizen, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us this morning for this important conversation. You know, when we first planned this event a few weeks ago, we wanted to talk about the state of civic engagement among young people in our country. But now, given the recent outcry and horrific acts at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, and those students who survived last week's horrific mass shooting, and the fact that our keynote speaker holds such deep ties to the state of Florida, I think today's discussion takes on a whole different meaning. Now, perhaps more than ever, our government and its leaders must prove that they're not just listening to our nation's young people, but that they're doing everything in their power to ensure that all students feel protected and valued in the eyes of our society. And one small step in that process can take place if we start to engage more young people at an earlier age. Right now, only 9 states, along with Washington, D.C., require high school students to complete a full year of civics before they can graduate. This likely explains why, according to a recent study from CAP, that less than 25% of all students achieve proficient scores in the civics exams administered by the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Perhaps more importantly, America's civic engagement is at an all-time low. Voter participation and public trust in government remains near historic lows, particularly with our nation's young people. Less than half of millennials are voting, and only 18% of the public trusts their leaders in Washington to do the right thing. This creates a vicious cycle where too many Americans are dissatisfied with their government and yet still fail to vote because they believe their voices will not be heard. The good news is that across the country we can find inspiring activists, policymakers, educators, and others who are turning apathy into action. We are honored to welcome 4 outstanding panelists this morning who are committed to motivating and engaging America's students, and we look forward to hearing their insights. But first, I have the great privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for today, Senator Bob Graham. During his remarkable career as a public servant, Senator Graham made it his mission to make life better for folks in his home state of Florida. He's served as a member of the Florida legislature, as the 38th governor of the state of Florida, and as a member of the United States Senate. And while in office, Senator Graham helped to redefine the term civic engagement. As governor, he spent nearly 400 days working in a wide range of jobs, from police officer to construction worker, from fisherman to teacher, so he could better understand the challenges facing the people he represented. Since leaving the Senate, Senator Graham has devoted his energy toward training the next generation of civic leaders. He's founded the Bob Graham Center for Public Service at the University of Florida to teach young people the knowledge and skills of democratic governance. And he's also opened the Florida Joint Center on Citizenship to strengthen civics education in the Sunshine State and to rally its legislature to require a civics education for all students. Senator Graham truly embodies what it means to be an agent of change at this local, state, and federal levels, and we're so honored that he could join us this morning to talk about his experiences. So please join me in a warm round of applause and welcome Senator Bob Graham.
Winnie, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity that the Center has given me to talk about a subject about which I'm passionate and which I believe the the nation is beginning to recognize its central importance. I have been so first depressed, saddened by what occurred at Stone Douglas High School a week ago today, and then excited and enlivened by what the students have done in response to that tragedy. One of the things that interests me is that Florida, like most states, stopped teaching civics in the 1970s. Civics was restored to the curriculum of our schools by legislative action in 2009, became operational in 2011. The significance of those numbers is that this group of students who are now at Stone Douglas Senior High School were the first wave of students in Florida public education to have had civics in almost 4 decades. The fact that they are now empowered to take the actions that we are seeing, and that we hope that we will see actions that result in real change in the near future, I think is a testimony to the value of exposing young people to their rights, responsibilities, and the competencies necessary to execute those rights and responsibilities as a member of a democracy. So we have a story within a story within a story occurring now, and a tragic event might be what it takes to achieve a renewal of America's awareness of the importance of preparing all of our people, but particularly our young people, for their life as citizen in a democracy. And this is occurring at a time when there are plenty of headlines that indicate the severity of the current circumstance. From the New Yorker of August of last year, is America headed for a new kind of civil war? A group of scholars were assembled actually before Charlottesville to discuss the issue of whether America was headed for not a Lee versus Grant, but a new form of civil war. 35% of the participants in this program felt that we were, and that it would be within 10 to 15 years. David Brooks in the New York Times in January opined on how democracies perish. Vox brought together 20 of America's top political scientists to discuss democracy. They were scared. If current trends continue for another 20 or 30 years, democracy will be toast. And then finally, from the Boston Globe, a toxic election is damaging the seed corn of democracy, young voters. And the statistics that support those headlines are equally distressing. Most Americans have little knowledge of national, state, or local government. A 2017 survey indicated that only 26% of Americans could name the 3 branches of government. There's a declining acceptance of citizenship responsibility. In 2016, U.S. voter turnout was 55.7%, which ranked us 28th among 35 developed democratic countries in the world. And local elections are even more distressing. Between the beginning of this century and 10 years later, the number of persons in the 144 largest metropolitan areas of America who voted in local elections declined from 26% to 20%. In 2013, only 6.4% of Americans belonged to an organization such as the League of Women Voters or a Kiwanis Club or a PTA that had as its goal community action. Younger voters are a particular losing confidence in democracy. Last year, a survey indicated that 35% of millennials are losing faith in democracy. Only 1 in 4 had confidence in the democratic system as a means of governance. And voter turnout in every presidential election since 1904, since 2004, the lowest generational grouping have been millennials. In 2012, whereas the oldest generation, over 65, 72% of Americans voted. With millennials, it was only 46%. So those all indicate the validity of these concerns about the state of our democracy as we begin the 21st century. Why has this decline occurred? We're not alone. There has been a global movement away from democracy and towards authoritarianism. Countries that we used to think of as having moved past being emerging democracies to being mature democracies, such as a Turkey, have now slipped back into authoritarian rule. I think we in America are legitimately concerned as to whether we may be on a similar path. Why is this happening? I think one of the reasons that the students in Tallahassee today are living is the question of, can democracy respond to the challenges of the day? We face this challenge throughout our history. There have been times when we questioned whether the democratic processes were capable of bringing solutions to complex problems. In most of those instances, democracy has met the challenge. Today it is being challenged again. I think the students are asking the question, can something as fundamental as providing safety for young people in their educational settings be assured, is a challenge for democratic institutions to be able to effectively answer. We await the determination as to whether that in fact occurs. I think that one of the fundamental reasons why we have reached this low state is the very fact that we stopped teaching civics in the 1970s. Why did we do that? Well, some of the scholars of democracy have attributed it to the fact that in that time period there was an increasing polarization in America, with the far left thinking that the civics education was being used to militarize students so they would be more accepting of the Vietnam War. People on the far right feeling that civic education was being used to motivate students to engage in activities such as the civil rights movement, women's rights movement, other forms of public display which they found to be offensive. There was one thing the extreme right and the extreme left could agree on, and that was that civics was not a good idea, and so they began leading an effort first at the local level, then at the state level, to eliminate civics. I graduated from Miami Senior High School in 1955. I had taken 3 one-year courses in civics between the 7th and the 12th grade, and that was not unusual. That was, in fact, the national standard. I have 11 grandchildren, 9 of whom have graduated from high school. Most of those 9 students have had no civics. The most any of them have had is 1 semester. That's what has happened in 2 generations of an American family. What do we do to begin to reverse this decline? Let me just share a personal story. In 1973, I was chairman of the Florida State Senate Education Committee. We were holding our hearings before the legislative session in schools around Florida. And on this particular day, we were at Wolfson High School, a middle-class high school in Jacksonville, Florida. We had a slot in the agenda for students to come and talk about their concerns. And on this particular day at Wolfson, there were a large number of students, all who had the same issue, probably one of the most long-standing issues in American public education: bad food in the cafeteria. I was not surprised that the food was bad. It wasn't great at Miami High, but I was surprised that they had come to the state Senate to talk about cold pizza on Friday. I asked, were we the first people they'd talked to? And they said, no, actually, you're the third. That made me feel better until I asked who were 1 and 2. Number 1 was the mayor of Jacksonville, who empathized with the students but said that it wasn't his responsibility. The second was the sheriff of Duval County, who said the food was no doubt bad, but it wasn't criminal, wasn't his responsibility. We were number 3. I told that story a few weeks later when I spoke to a group of civics teachers in Miami, that something was wrong if a group of bright high school students, many of them about to graduate, had come to the conclusion that the mayor, the sheriff, or the state legislature was the place you went for bad food. One of the teachers stood up and said, I am sick to death of you politicians telling teachers how to do our work better when you don't know what in the hell you're talking about. And the only way you can find out is to actually go in the classroom and experience what it's like to be around indifferent students, to be around parents who won't show up for a parent-teacher conference, of overly bureaucratic school administration, and all those damn laws that you legislators pass that we have to live by. So she said the only way you can find out is to actually come in the classroom. I accepted her challenge, thinking that she had in mind a couple of hours on Tuesday afternoon. When she called back, she had a somewhat different idea. She said, Bob, come to Carroll City Senior High School, an almost inner-city high school in Miami, on the day after Labor Day at 8 o'clock in the morning, report to room 208, and you will be teaching 12th grade American Civics for the next 18 weeks. Well, that was a little more than I had quite bargained for, but I figured that A, I had committed myself, I was going to do it, B, I needed help, and I found a young social science teacher at Carroll City who shared my ideas about how civics ought to be taught, and he agreed to co-teach the class. We spent the summer working on a curriculum. And the curriculum was built around answering the question, what does a citizen need to know to make democracy work for them? What does a citizen need to know to make democracy work for them? And that's the course that we taught for 18 weeks. It became a life-transforming event. I not only learned a lot about life in a modern American high school, I learned a lot about learning, the difference between learning by actually doing something as opposed to learning by lecture or textbook. I also learned that some of that was transportable to other areas. And as Meany said, I started taking work days. The one at Carroll City was number 1, and I did another 407 over the next 30 years in order to feel that I had a connectedness and understanding with the people of my state. 30 years later, as I retired from the U.S. Senate, I was a senior fellow at the Kennedy School, and I taught, as every fellow is required to do, although at Harvard, you don't teach unless you are a member of the faculty. You can lead, you can guide, you can direct, whatever verb you want to use, but you can't teach. So I did one of those things using a modified version of the same curriculum, what every citizen needs to know. That course was, I found that the Harvard undergraduates of the early part of this century were only mildly more civically illiterate than the high school students that I had taught 30 years earlier. Some of the faculty at the Kennedy School monitored the course and recommended that I try to put the curriculum into book form. And the result of that was a book called America, the Owner's Manual, You Can Fight City Hall and Win. The book is based around the 10 competencies of effective citizenship. Following the Harvard model, each chapter begins with a case study of how citizens used that particular competence to achieve their objective. And then it describes how you can master that skill. I hope those are some of the things that the students from Stoneman Douglas are doing today in Tallahassee. I believe from that experience that not only is it critical to return civics to the classroom, but it's also critical that it be returned in the right form. Most of what is now civics is based on a study of the institutions and processes of government. I remember one of the things that I had to do in one of those one-year courses was memorize the state capitals of all 50 states. And I still remember to this day that the capital of South Dakota is Minneapolis. I personally think that Jefferson would have been very disturbed with this. In his early writings on the importance of public education to a new democracy, Jefferson said that a primary goal of our schools should be to give to every citizen, and I emphasize the word every. He was very critical of the idea that civics was for an elite few, that every citizen should be given the information needed to understand his duties to his neighbors and his country, and to discharge with competence. Competence is a word that I believe is inadequately emphasized in most civics instruction. But to discharge with competence the functions confided to him by either. That is what I think should be the purpose of a civics education. And that, what does that convert to? That converts to issues of skills. Are we preparing students with the skills that would allow them to first discern that there is a problem or a missed opportunity, and then to exercise a series of competencies necessary to overcome the problem or achieve the missed opportunity? I also believe that civics is like a musical instrument or a sport. You don't learn to play the piano by reading a textbook about the piano. You learn to play the piano by playing the piano. You learn civics by actually engaging. In that course that I referred to at Carroll City, the first day we organized the students into groups of 3 so that they would begin to learn some of the principles of small group interaction and select a topic that was of concern to them. They could have selected any topic that they wanted, human rights in China, but they had this constraint that 1/3 of their final grade was going to be based on what they were able to do about the problem. Were they able to move the needle over the 18 weeks? That got them focused on things that were close at home. As an example, Carroll City had a private water and sewer company, and there had been a long time feeling that the water that that company was providing to its customers was below grade. Uh, a group of three of students wanted to take on that issue. Was it below grade? Well, the first thing that they did is they went to the chemistry department of Carroll City, and they learned the standards that you have to utilize if you are going to challenge a product, in this case water, as to its cleanliness and efficacy. Because civics does not occur in a vacuum. It almost always requires knowledge of other topics in order to be effective. With that understanding, they collected dozens of bottles of water according to the scientific standards. They then had to find out who was the decision maker. It was not difficult because in our federalist system, we distribute political responsibility broadly. In this case, they've determined that it was the county health director who was responsible. They went to the office of the county health director with all their bottles, asked that the water be analyzed, and the finding was that yes, the water was bad. And the county health director began issuing cease and desist orders to this private utility company. Needless to say, those students got a very high grade in terms of how they moved the needle. I think that kind of practical learning is a key part of an effective civics curriculum. I also think it's important that in most cases you start local, as these students did with local water supply. I'm concerned, I have a granddaughter who next week is going to participate in a model United Nations. I'm a supporter of the United Nations. It's an important global institution. But I really think that the students would probably be better served if they were going to spend a few days doing a model school board or a model city council or an activity that was more relevant to their current lives. Those are some of the principles that I think should be incorporated into a civics curriculum, which should in turn return to the American public school system. I think this is a critically important issue. We cannot go another generation lost by failure to expose them to the basic principles and competencies of citizenship in a democracy. The students from Stonewall Douglas are this morning displaying what it means to society to have young people who are prepared to be not just passive spectators, but active participants in making their community, their school, their state, their nation a more democratic place for all its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Senator, we've got time for one question for the senator, and then we're going to bring up the panel talking about engagement and civics. It's exciting. Great. Go over to this gentleman over here. There's a microphone. If you just state your name and maybe if you have an affiliation and the question. Thank you.
I'm Bill Bystricky with Growing Democracy. I loved what you said about you don't learn to play the piano by reading a textbook. I was wondering, do you agree with Lawrence Tribe and other scholars who have said that we should lower the voting age so that people studying civics can participate in elections?
I honestly don't have an opinion as to whether moving the voting age from 18 to 16, for instance, would be advantageous. Probably in a spirit of enhancing democracy, I would say it wouldn't be a bad thing for maybe some states to use the laboratory of democracy, which states are supposed to do, and experiment with that and see what the results were, and then we could make a judgment as to whether it appeared to be an idea worthy of nationwide adoption.
Great. Again, thank Senator Graham for your leadership, for your civics lesson to us this morning. And I'm going to invite my colleague, Catherine Brown, and the panel to come up to the stage. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being with us this morning to discuss this important event, this important issue. My name is Catherine Brown. I'm the Vice President for Education Policy here at the Center for American Progress. And we are going to dive right in. We're going to do a slightly different format where I'm not going to formally introduce the panelists at the outset. Instead, I'm going to give a short history of their bio when I ask them an introductory question. So I want to start with you, Stephanie, and I'd like to do, so this is Stephanie Sanford. She's the Chief of Global Policy at the College Board. She's also the author of Civic Life in the Information Age, Politics, Technology, and Generation X, and the former Director of Policy and Advocacy for the United States Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a deep expert in this topic. So I want to start with some level setting. Stephanie, could you just tell us the difference between civics and history?
So thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, and this is an issue near and dear to my heart. I thought the senator did a super job at really delineating the difference. I mean, at its most basic level, history is what happened before. It's a study of the past, and what civics is something that's quite active, right? That is the study of rights and duties and responsibilities to be an effective citizen in a democracy. So the way we have talked about on other panels, I've shared the dais with Generation Citizen a number of times over this last year. The notion that we have, you need civics means sort of knowledge, so you know what to do, and you know about these institutions. You have skills, you know how to engage with them, and you have agency, which says you believe that you can make a difference.
Wonderful. There's been a fair amount of research on the focus, and Senator Graham alluded to this, on the focus on reading and math, and then even going back to the 1970s, that has pushed out civics and other topics as well, art, music, history, physical education, and so forth. I'm curious, Stephanie, if you think that we have a new opportunity with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which creates a broader definition of school success to bring civics back into American education today.
I think so. There certainly is the charge that that a somewhat narrow focus on reading and math has pushed out other topics, and I think that ESSA clears that up. Very clearly says, explicitly calls for a well-rounded education and calls out civics and government quite specifically, sort of to reestablish a broader range of educational experience and enriched curriculum. I also think to caution that the notion of pushed out does imply that there was some intent to do that. I do think that the senator had an excellent articulation of the pressure that civic education in particular came under. But the idea that in focusing on reading, I mean, when we redesigned the SAT 2 years ago, that is a test of sort of reading, writing, and math. And one of the things that we did was to assure that that of the 7 million students who will take either the PSAT or the SAT each year, that you would encounter an American founding document or another document of that sort of great conversation. And so the idea that whether you would find the Constitution or the Declaration or Barbara Jordan's testimony to the Judiciary Committee during impeachment, the idea that a broad-based instrument that you would encounter, through just reading, that you would encounter these texts, I think was an important innovation. And so while ESSA I do think is a great opportunity, it's also, there isn't anything that in the old sort of focusing on reading and writing that says that you couldn't read these meaningful texts.
Great, that's an excellent point. Thank you so much. I want to turn to Juanita now, who's joining us from Providence, Rhode Island, where she was an 8th grade social studies and Generation Citizen teacher. And she currently manages Generation Citizen's national program and curricular development and serves on the Generation Citizen's Rhode Island board. So Juanita, another barrier we have heard when we looked into this issue is that most educators want to remain neutral to politics in their classroom. And talking about current events and civics today in a way that values all students' experiences, cultures, identities, and values can be very challenging. It's a very charged environment. And I'd love to hear how you dealt with this challenge in your classroom, and then how you advise other Generation Citizen teachers to deal with it through the curriculum that you're developing.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. In my classroom, one of the things that I would do, and actually was very interesting during the last election to be very neutral in the classroom. And we did have many discussions in terms of what was going on the national level. But I kept turning it back into what's going on in your local community. And in Generation Citizen, that was a very natural thing to do. So we emphasize and try to have students focus on hyperlocal issues, very similar to what Senator Graham was referring to with his version of the curriculum many years ago, which was really exciting that that was happening at that time, because we do something very similar. We just labeled it Action Civics. So I had students just come back to what's going on in our community and how does it affect you. And once you start talking about how it affects you, a lot of the barriers that you could encounter talking about controversial issues kind of lessen and diminish. And then there are times when you're talking about things like police brutality where you need to have these hard conversations and have a safe space for your students to have them. And it's difficult work to do. So right now in my new role, working with teachers nationwide, we try to provide guidance for them to have those conversations. And we're currently working on a revision to our curriculum, and one of the top priorities is to ensure that we're looking at an equity framework and ensuring that all of our lessons incorporate those elements to make sure that all of our students' needs are being met, and it's that every student component, not just developmental stage or learning ability, but any other type of diversity that we can consider.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I want to turn now to Scott, who's the co-founder and CEO of Generation Citizen, where he has worked to expand Action Civics in schools, curricula, and empower young people to become engaged in their communities. Scott, you saw a real need for students to become active participants in their democracy. Can you tell us about Generation Citizen's model, a little bit about the history, and how you sequence the instruction in order to give all students the knowledge, skills, and agency that Stephanie referred to earlier?
Yeah, and thanks so much for having us and for having this event. It's obviously a very timely issue, and it's gratifying to see so many folks talking and recognizing the importance of civics education, especially in this moment. I think Senator Graham did a great job distilling both the problem and some of the solutions that we think about as well. I helped co-found Generation Citizen about 8 years ago. My own background, actually, I grew up the son of a foreign service officer, so I grew up in emerging democracies and around the world. So Senator Graham was talking about how we see distinctions between emerging democracies and more emerged democracies. I got to observe elections in Kenya, which actually worked in 2002. They're having trouble now. Saw a coup in Ecuador in 2005, and saw runoff elections in Zimbabwe in 2008, and really was motivated by both the power and fragility of democracy. So the power of what happens when people come together to make a collective difference, and the fragility. It's something that needs to be cultivated and tended to. Democracy is not a static concept. And when I got back to the U.S., recognized, and this gets to the model question, the extent to which I think the trope, and I think Carolyn will talk to this too, but the trope of young people being disengaged is not true. That's something that people talk about. They talk about the millennial generation not being as engaged. That's not true. What can be true is young people not necessarily seeing politics and government as the way to affect change. I think that is something that occurs for a whole host of reasons. But one is that they don't see democracy and government as relevant to their lives. And it becomes this abstract concept that either isn't taught or is taught in a way that's, here are the three branches of government, here's how a bill becomes a law, now go take a test. So this is the piano analogy. And if you're going to teach civics in that way, it's not going to be relevant to students. It's not going to be the vibrant concept that can bring it alive, like Juanita was able to do in her classroom. So what Generation Citizen actually does is something called Action Civics. You put action before civics and it changes everything. But it sort of is the practicing the piano approach, where students choose very local issues that they care about, and then learn about how local government works through actually taking action on those issues. And it's a real school class. It's not an after-school activity. It's not an extracurricular, but they're taking this just like they're taking math, science, or English. And so it'll be choosing issues like affordable housing and gentrification in New York City, and then looking at specific city council laws that would provide affordable housing to provide tax incentives to landlords that provide affordable housing. So I get tripped up when I say it. But these are 11th graders that are working on an issue like that. And another example that I love, because this actually goes to something Senator Graham said, every student always wants to tackle cafeteria food. That's the issue that they always want to do. So we had a class in Brooklyn that looked at cafeteria food. And through our curriculum, we actually really encourage them to go to the root cause of the issue. Why does it actually exist? It's not about raising awareness, but how can you actually think about systemic root causes? So they actually found that, in a lot of restaurants, they have the A, B, C grades, like the sanitation grades. So New York schools actually have those grades, but they weren't required to be public. So they did go to the state legislature, but this was the right body to go to in this case. And they got the state legislature, they successfully convinced them to pass a bill that now requires schools to publish their sanitation grades. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that right away that cold pizza is going to become gourmet. But I think what it did get them to realize is, oh, we care about cafeteria food in our school, and we're going to learn about how the state legislature works, and actually using that and making that relevant to our own lives, and expanding that so it's more relevant in the community too. So that's how Action Civics works, very similar to the framework Senator Graham did, but really going in on local issues, figuring out the root cause, and it's all about how do we get civics and politics to be as exciting as when I saw it in emerging democracies growing up. And I do think we have a moment in this country where students, and you're seeing this in response to Parkland, are recognizing the relevance of democracy and government in their own lives, and that's the knob that needs to be turned.
So much. I want to bring Carolyn into the conversation, who's the CEO of Rock the Vote. So this panel has been focused on what happens in schools and how schools and educators can better prepare students to be active citizens. But if the goal of civics education, as Senator Graham was challenging us in the green room earlier, is to really prepare students throughout their lives to be active citizens, to participate in their democracies, we have to look beyond schools and think about the whole continuum of how you engage young people. Can you tell us what you've learned about youth engagement more broadly, and specifically how Rock the Vote is contributing to helping young people?
Yeah, well, first, thank you for having us. I think, as been discussed on the panel already, it's very timely, and I hope, if anything has come out of the tragedy in Parkland, that it is that the students there are disabusing everyone in the country of something that we know at Rock the Vote, that young people are very engaged and they are very knowledgeable, and that with agency and with civic education and with empowerment, that they actually will move things. I think the issue we see is because of the state of civic education, that a lot of young people, when they turn 18 or get out of their traditional institutions of higher education, that they are not prepared at all, and they've inherited a very broken system. And excuse me. And so what we do at Rock the Vote is, our mission is to build political power for young people, but that involves a lot of things, and civic education is part of that. So one of the pieces we've seen is young people are really questioning the power of their vote in a very serious way. And are seeing other avenues. So that's why you're seeing a lot more protests in the streets, from issues from Black Lives Matter to gun violence and a whole slew of different issues. And so one of the things that I think civic education, both in the schools and out of the schools, can do a better job of is really tying it to the issue, tying their civic participation to the issues that impact their community, because I do think, and impact their daily lives, because I do think that there's a very big disconnect when they're 18 years old of how do these issues actually impact my day-to-day life. And if you can bring it down to the community level, it's both a strategy and a tactic to get them engaged. And so that's sort of the first step, is showing them that they can have impact with their vote, or by approaching a state senator, a state representative, or whoever their elected officials are that move the issue. But then also educating them on the registration and voting process, quite frankly. That should be part of civics education. It is different in every state. It is terribly confusing, and purposely so. So those are just some pieces that we work to do, is a lot of education and then guiding people through the process.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So now I want to get into some of the solutions, particularly some of the policy solutions. And I'd love to ask Stephanie and also Scott, one of the things that has emerged in a number of states, and CAP today released a product that I would encourage you all to pick up. It's called The State of Civics Education, and my colleague Sarah Shapiro and I did a 50-state analysis of what the state of civics education is in every state. And one of the policy solutions we've seen emerge is requiring students to take a citizenship test. And I'm curious what your reaction is. Will this actually get at some of these low voter participation rates that we're seeing? Would love to hear any thoughts on that as a policy solution.
I mean, I think the idea that the citizenship test, which in preparation for this, after we talked for our prep call, I actually went and took it online this weekend.
Oh, wow.
Just to tell you kind of how I spend my weekends. And so it's 100 questions, and it's quite rudimentary. And like 17 states, I believe, have done this, and actually met when I was in Arizona before the holidays. I met actually with a state senator who saw that as a step one. So I think one, it's step one. It's by no means the answer. No assessment. Assessment simply is some sort of measure of knowledge. But the idea that this would somehow be too high a bar, just to give you an example of a couple of the questions that are on the test. We elect U.S. representatives for how many years? Who was the first president? Who is president now? So the test itself took about 15 minutes, and it was a series of questions that are as simple as this. So a couple of things. One, it would be, I think, a terrible idea if that were at the end, right? That if the idea of civic knowledge was you needed to be able to answer, sort of 100, I would say, sort of elementary school type questions. But I do think that having that as a step one, because Senator Graham talked about just how little civic knowledge there really is, that the idea that 2/3 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. Arnie Duncan said, however, 75% can name all 3 Stooges and at least one judge on American Idol. So I mean, maybe this isn't such a terrible place to start.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think there's almost a distinction between the policy of it and the politics of it too. I think that I do think that this is a time that requires innovative policy solutions to the problem, and so we can talk through some of them. But I think that's important, and I think I agree with Stephanie that that every American should be able to pass the citizenship test. I don't think that that's a high bar. I think the challenge is, and I don't know if I have a particularly strong personal opinion on it, but the challenge is, are schools going to use that as step one, or because it's becoming assessed, is that going to be the sort of end game? And that's the fear, right? So to sort of extend other analogies, I mean, you don't teach science just by teaching the periodic test, right? So, I mean, the periodic table. So it's important to know the periodic table, which is probably inordinately harder than the citizenship test. But that's, and it's almost, as you were saying, I don't even know if the periodic table is step one, but it's integrated into the overall teaching, right? And so if we're saying after an effective civics course, you should be able to pass the citizenship test, I think that makes sense. I think the challenge is, and Juanita can maybe weigh on this too, are teachers going to see, oh, this is another requirement, I have to teach to this, and therefore not necessarily going to integrate everything else that makes a civics course effective. Now, I don't know, but I think that's the fear that, and we've been working on legislation in Massachusetts where this has sort of been integrated into it with everything else going on. When it's a standalone policy and that gets to the politics piece, it gets me a little bit more nervous. But I don't know how you would think about it if that was in your class.
So I actually played around with it a couple of years. And at the beginning of our semester, I had my Generation Citizen class and my social studies students both take the test. And actually, we had some teacher assistants and special educators in the classroom who took it along with us, just for fun, I guess. And many of the adults didn't pass it, and many of the students obviously didn't pass it either. They're 8th graders, and then we did it like a midterm, and then at the end of the school year. And I did see scores definitely went up. Did anyone pass it? I think a few students passed it, but it was kind of like set aside. It wasn't the focus for the year. That said, I don't think that it should definitely be a graduation requirement, because I know that's been floating around, because it sets our bar pretty low. I mean, a 15-minute test,
Yeah.
that's pretty low. I think my students were able to show their civic knowledge in different ways, talking about bills, reading a bill and pulling out the important parts of it and then making suggestions as to how we can improve it. There's some way we can assess that to make this more increasing the standards and our expectations for our students.
Like, yeah.
No, go
Yeah,
ahead.
please.
I was just going to say, I think building on that, like, there's the knowledge piece, right, that we're talking about. Is there is knowledge needed, but there's also skills that go into civic education, right? You have deliberation, collaboration, public speaking, writing, critical thinking, and those are increasingly important when we're talking about more and more of what we're accessing is actually online, and where we need to be able to teach kids to discern what's real, what's not, how to think about different issues, especially as we're becoming more polarized as well.
I think that Generation Citizen is such an excellent model. I mean, if we think about that, you need to know things and be able to do things and be able to apply. Know where, where can you find the information, or where are these decisions made? I loved the notion of the idea that you have to practice. It's a non-controversial idea that you would have to practice the piano. It's a non-controversial idea that you would have to practice free throws to get better at basketball. But somehow we don't think of it in terms of education generally, but particularly in civic education. And I think that, as I've gotten to know this model, is particularly that focus on localism that says, okay, here's a problem. How do I learn about that problem? How do I learn where it can be solved? How do I learn about the mechanisms of government? And it's through that, learning something, then doing something, then having an impact locally, which is much more likely closer to a community, that builds its own sense of agency. And I suspect you would find from your students that then once you've done that, then you have the agency in the sense of, I can do more on that. I can do more. I can recruit other people. I can be more active in my community. And I think that really animates a virtuous cycle of increased participation.
Yeah, I think one more thing I'd say on that, it's almost like I'd almost prefer like a local citizenship test, because I do agree on that.
Mayor.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm almost, if you know who the mayor is, you're going to know who the president is. I mean, that's just a given. And I'm almost more curious in, do you know which branch of government the chief of the police is in, rather than do you know the three branches of government? We were talking earlier about district attorneys and how that's galvanized people. Do you understand what the district attorney does? What their office actually allows them to do and which branch they're in, as opposed to do you know what the executive, judicial, and legislative all do. So I do think that the bar sometimes can be set too low on that.
I love that. I'm sorry.
No, go
I
ahead.
love that idea of having a more local citizenship test. Oftentimes in my class, I would have chart paper on the wall with the three branches, but then under them we weren't looking at federal. We weren't even often looking at state level. We were looking at where does the school board committee fit in, and how do they end up in the school board committee? Because in many different communities, it's done differently in different communities. And who are these folks? So let's learn a little bit about these people that are making extremely important decisions, from cold pizza on Friday to what am I wearing to where's our money going to. And I think that helps make this whole idea of government and democracy less abstracted, less daunting, and less scary for our students. At a very early age, I had my first Generation Citizen class was 6th graders, and they decided, they were upset about a lot of different things, and in the end, they realized they didn't really have a voice in our school. So they said, well, how about a student council? How about we become part of the government? And they created a student government, and then they started from that student government dealing with, okay, what do we think of the uniform policy? What do we think of our food, and contacting the actual folks that deal with the food? So I think definitely having the focus on the local government is so much more powerful for our students in K-12.
And is this, Carolyn, where do we start with this? Is this idea that you find out what drives students, what motivates them, what connects to their lives, and then you build a civics curriculum around that? That's sort of what I'm hearing, but I wanted to directly ask.
Me?
Yeah, I'm
Or-
curious, actually, Juanita and Caroline. How do you tap into young people to get them engaged? What are the most powerful
It is
sources?
issue driven. It is also the idea that they have agency. And so usually you can see that more on the local level in the communities. So one of the things we focused on in 2017 was actually municipal elections. For instance, we provide an election center that breaks down what offices actually do, what their responsibilities are, who's running for them. We have links to their websites, to their social media, everything that you would possibly want. And we did that in 2016 as well. In 2016, we had 4 million users access the information. In 2017, it was obviously lower than that, but we also teamed up with local groups to develop voter guides based on the issues that were actually impacting their community. And so young people were designing questions and then contacting candidates and getting the answers to those questions, and then we would post it on to our website. And because our name was associated with it, a lot of times the candidates were actually more responsive to them.
I think that one of the things that we do really well, and there's always room for improvement, so we're working on it still, at Generation Citizen, is creating a democratic classroom culture. And that's ensuring that our curriculum and the space that it's taught in is very student-centered and student-driven, because it is an action-based, it's project-based learning, essentially, when you talk about it in educational terms. So ensuring that students have the confidence, the space, the vocabulary, the activities to look at the different issues. So we start with creating a classroom constitution. How are we going to approach the semester? And we focus on, we emphasize that it is a living document. So throughout the semester, there are points where, we're in a classroom with 28 kids. It's not all going to be lovely all the time and roses. So, okay, let's stop. Let's go back to the Constitution. What are we doing well? What do we need to work on? Do we need to make edits? Let's remind ourselves of how we're supposed to be working, and then moving forward. And creating that sense of accountability for students and that ownership in what they're doing also comes from consensus building, which I think we do a really nice job of, and it's a really fun activity that turns into often a very lively debate with students sharing very personal feelings on many different topics where they're deciding what issue they're going to focus on as a whole class for the entire semester. So you need some class buy-in. And even when you don't have 100% of students, which I don't know if that's ever happened, 100% of students excited about that one issue that they're going to work on for the entire semester, we also focus on tapping into everyone's skills. Are you really good at writing? How do you feel about, are you, kind of an extrovert and are okay calling a legislator on the phone or calling a community activist? Or do you love to do research? Well, then you could be on the research team. So, we have the action research component that helps with that too. So I think having, again, student-led, student-centered, and a space for everyone to be able to participate at some level during the semester make it a very powerful program.
Great. So pulling up to the policy level, if you could design the perfect set of requirements, interventions, I'm curious, as a state policymaker, Stephanie, what would you put in place? It sounds like you think the citizenship is a reasonable baseline. Would you add things on top? I know you're very aware of all the different mandates and challenges and things that schools are trying to accomplish these days.
I think the campaign for the civic mission of schools has got a policy agenda out, and I would highly recommend that. And it looks at how do you teach civics, how do you give meaningful responsibilities, how do you engage in the community, how do you have within school activities that develop agency. I think policy is a pretty blunt instrument for this, and just even we're people who very much agree here, and there's a lot, I think, of vitality and imagination within this sector right now. So I think I would look at the Campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools. They've got a lot of history in making real progress. A number of states are taking action right now. But to have some humility about getting sort of too muscular about policy right now, because I do think we're in a moment where, whether it's the events in Florida, the increased participation, the innovation within classrooms, I think a renewed interest in civic action is, rather than trying to get one size fits all, to really set baselines and allow for a lot of experimentation and variation.
So I agree with all that, and so we actually, along with a broad coalition, are just releasing, or it's not us, it's the state legislature releasing a policy proposal in Massachusetts, a bill in Massachusetts. So it's sort of building on what's been done in Florida, what's been done in Illinois, and it's a pretty robust policy. And the way that this came about was talking to folks like Civics, which does online games for civics education, which was started by Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, talking to the JFK Museum. So it really is a cross-organizational collaboration. And what the bill is going to do is essentially provide a suite of different options that schools can do. So it's looking at, as a graduation requirement, students should take some sort of civic project twice before they graduate. So it does have that in place. It will increase funding for teachers to engage in this professional development, because that doesn't happen right now, and actually launch some sort of almost like a spelling bee for civics in Massachusetts, just to get students thinking about this. So I think it'll be interesting. It's trying to be one of the more robust policies that's out there, and the Massachusetts legislature has made this a priority. So it will be interesting to see what happens. The second thing, and this goes more on Stephanie's point, I think there is an opportunity beyond just state level policy, which I do think is important, and you've seen Illinois and Florida specifically engage in some interesting work, largely around funding and assessment. So I think those are two of the lever points. But I do think, we always talk about schools as having a historical civic mission and having a historical civic purpose, but we don't really talk about what that means. And so I'm curious if there's a way to almost incorporate democracy and educating young people to be citizens as more of a framework for schools. So rather than just a civics class, I think civics class is important. I also think it's relatively insufficient. If all we're talking about is one class, and that's what policy is going to do, is get one class in 8th grade, that's not enough. I don't think any of us agree that that's enough. And so the way that we've started thinking about it a bit, and this goes to what Winnie was talking about in terms of the culture, but how can schools really embrace classes that are relevant, a culture that is democratic, and that they engage with the community around them themselves. And so that means that in science class, they're measuring the pH levels of water to figure out, are they safe? That means in English class, they're writing letters to the editor using persuasive communication techniques. That means in math class, they're looking at traffic patterns and figuring out if there's a way to solve that by the school. So it's thinking about it holistically as opposed to policy as a blunt instrument. I think both of those have to happen at the same time.
I like that you said that, and sorry. And actually, the school that I was teaching at Roger Williams Middle School in Providence, they actually began this year focusing on a civic, they're calling it a civic strand in the school. So trying to do some of what Scott is, just mentioned. So I'm excited to see what that's going to look like, and if any other schools around the nation are working towards that, because I can see how that could definitely be a really great way to approach this.
Are there information sharing networks between states? Do you feel like there's been a surge of interest in this issue and people are talking? I think you're probably part of a lot of these conversations, Scott, because I know
I would say talking. There's a lot of interest in it. I don't have a sense of there being a great, robust infrastructure yet to be able to, to share best practices or to have states collaborate.
Yeah.
I think you've seen among the service groups, national service groups, you've seen their creation into a coalition for sort of service year idea.
Yeah.
We've had conversations with them, sort of the civic education community. Are there, if we believe that you need sort of knowledge, skills, and agencies, can we bring the knowledge people together with the skills and agency people? And I think very much to what Scott was talking about, which is how can you then have these be really authentic experiences?
Yep.
No, I love Scott's perspective, which is to work on real-world problems, because we do see that young people like to do that. I sort of the great progressive educator Debbie Meyer said, that young people need to come into contact with a range of adults they can see themselves becoming. And that the notion of high school in particular is it's become really insular. And I think, implicit in what each of us are talking about is some way in which to better engage young people in the problems of their communities. That's a way to build relevant, to tie the knowledge to relevant experience and build that sense of agency that they can and should be engaged in problem solving in their communities.
So you mentioned something I wanted to pick up on, which is that core to the knowledge piece is that the information you're getting is accurate and that you can discern fact from fiction from opinion. And how does, we've obviously seen a prevalence of fake news, and this is a challenge that young people are facing with just a wealth of information across the internet. How does civics education help solve that problem, if at all? Scott?
That's the issue of the day. I mean, I do think that media literacy absolutely has to be a component of civics education and trying to figure out how you distill real news from news that might not be as accurate. And that's something, I mean, again, I think focusing on the local is really important. I think I read a stat the other day that 65% of millennials get the majority of their news from Facebook. So that's just a fact, right? That is happening. So I do think that there's more news literacy that needs to happen. I will say, I mean, I also think, not to just badger on, but I think that the companies and the social media networks need to do a better job too, and recognize their responsibility. Because just seeing this as an open marketplace, it's going to put too much pressure on educators and on young people themselves to be able to distill that. So both of those have to happen at the same time. And it's interesting, I haven't thought about it in this light, but I do think that there's almost like, as a civic agenda, figuring out how do you actually regulate. I mean, I'm punching above my pay grade here, but how do you actually regulate some of those folks so that they actually see it as part of their mission? Because if you have 60-70% of young people getting their news from Facebook, they have an obligation to figure out how to help distill that too, at least in my opinion.
Carolyn, you've done a lot of work in digital literacy. Any reflections on this fake news question and how we can help solve it?
Yeah, I mean, I, like Scott, hope that some of the social media platforms take responsibility and do what's right. But I also think that the Action Civics model of creating and helping students build critical thinking skills and deliberating and figuring out what is opinion and what is fact and what is fake are important. I also, one thing we haven't kind of discussed here, but I think can come into that, is the support that we need to provide teachers who kind of take on things that may in their community seem more political or may be political. Excuse me. And I think that's a real challenge that a lot of teachers are facing and need to beef up the districts to support them. But in terms of digital, it is something that is not going away and needs to be addressed. And there are great groups actually doing a lot of research on this, but needs to be better incorporated with civic education, definitely.
Great. So we don't have a ton of time left before we get to your questions, and I wanted to do a quick round robin. Carolyn, you sort of touched on this in terms of supporting teachers, and would love to hear any advice you have for educators or policymakers as they're thinking about this issue. Does anyone want to start? Carolyn?
I just have one piece that we haven't actually addressed that I think we all work in so deeply, but isn't part of the conversation a lot, is just the inequity in civic education also, and how, I think Winnie said, a quarter of young people pass the civic assessment, but wealthy white students were 4 to 6 times more likely than Hispanic and Black students to be considered proficient in it. And so that needs to be a part of the conversation. If we're having assessments, if we're having these, then support and resources really need to go to the places that are needed and have equity.
Incredibly important. Thank you for underscoring that.
And along with that, we also know that Black, Brown students and students in low-income areas, a lot of the urban areas, have never had and will never have experienced things like a debate, a classroom debate, or like mock trials, or any of these wonderful things that we know create critical thinkers. Or help create critical thinkers. And I think that in terms of supporting a teacher, I know I took on a lot more than I could probably handle a lot of times, trying to make sure my students had access to and were exposed to as much as possible during that time, that short amount of time they were with me. And I wish I could have done more. And I know that that's a big struggle, because if you're a teacher, you're here for a reason, and you mean well and you want to do the best, but we simply often don't have the capacity to do it. So creating that for us is just critical in order to keep moving civic education into, what we want it to look like, and to ensure that we do have future active citizens.
Such an important point.
I think the last thing, and this goes off these comments, is and we didn't touch on this as much, but just ensuring that we are listening to the students, and that student voice is omnipresent in all these conversations. So I think when we're asking what the best type of civic education is, ensuring that we're actually listening to them when we're talking about news literacy. I don't even know the platforms that young people are engaging on these days. So actually listening to them and figuring out what they're engaging on is really important. And I think that it goes back to what's happened in the last week. And I think what's been so powerful about the students from Florida is that they have made themselves be seen as legitimate actors. I'm not even going to say that they were seen as legitimate actors from the start, but their specific knowledge on this and their passion. And I think this is always what I believed in the power of young people, their ability to see the world for what it can be rather than what it is. Whereas I think, like, when we get in these gun control debates, there is a sense of stagnation. Like, we know how this is going to end. They are not seeing this like that right now. And I think that that's something incredibly powerful. So just making sure that we are not talking about civics education being done to young people, but that we're working with them to co-construct the democracy that we want, rather than the one that we have today.
Stephanie, any final thoughts?
The theme of listening. I was a number of us were at the Newseum in September, a wonderful day-long sort of discussion of civic education, and one of the real highlights was Justice Sotomayor spoke at the end of the day. She has taken over the chair of the board of Civics, which is what Justice O'Connor, so the group that she started. And she gave a wonderful sort of talk about civic education, the importance of the Constitution, and then she walked through the crowd and took questions, sort of one-on-one. And there was a moment, there were young people there. And so I want to say that, yes, we need to listen to young people, and that was very much so, but also we also need to listen to each other. So there was a young undergraduate who was just sort of like seething in response, and she said, how can you talk, said to the justice, her question was, how can you talk about all of this free speech when so many people are just so wrong? What do I do? And by the way, that's exactly what happened in that meeting. The adults were like, okay. And there was a little laugh. And she put her hand on that young woman's shoulder and said, listen. And I do think that as we talk and consider knowledge, agency, voice, protest, that the flip side of that is that, yes, we listen to young people, but we also listen to each other.
Great way to end. Thank you so much. We would love to take your questions. If you could raise your hand and state your name and the organization that you're here with, that would be terrific. This woman in the front row, please.
Elizabeth Davis, president of the Washington Teachers Union, and I want to thank all of you and Senator for your comments. I am a teacher of 40 years in D.C. I was at one of the schools involved in the Brown case about 7 years ago when I discovered that the school was the subject of Bowling v. Sharp. And of course, I was excitedly telling my sixth graders about the case, and they told me they weren't interested. The school was de facto resegregated, deplorable condition, run down 53 years after Brown. And of course, they complained every day about no library, no books. And I said, listen, this is a chance for you to talk to the people that can make the difference. And one of the young ladies, a sixth grader, said, what are they celebrating, Ms. Davis? They're celebrating this? That we have the same books that were here in 1953. But the kids went before the city council and shared their thoughts. And I asked them to just write your council members and we'll go before the council. We did. They were spotted on DC Cable and by Congressional Black Caucus on the 50th anniversary of Brown and said, could the kids come down to talk about Bowling case? The Bowling case, sure. But they thought they were going to come to regurgitate the facts, the dates, the timeline. They went and talked about the deplorable condition of their school 50 years after Brown. And sitting in that meeting with Senator Kennedy and Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi, who asked him to come to the Senate's commemoration. As a result, the school which was slated for demolition was restored, modernized, and is now sitting there in Ward 7 of DC. And the students, of course, and I do concur with what you said, after that project, taking the information that they learned in class and using it to solve a real world problem for them, empowered them to believe that they can do anything else. And they did. They organized PTA. And I learned from them that teaching them how to apply the knowledge and knowing that I cannot remain neutral in my classroom no matter how hard I tried was going to be the key. And allowing them to cite the problems in their school and community, use the lessons that I teach them to apply to solving those problems. And I do appreciate the message that you brought this morning, because we have really lost contact with the need for civic engagement, civics in our schools, every school, and especially in these times. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Gentleman in the second row.
I have to agree with all of that. Bill Klein, I'm a retired Army physician who I think, with maybe one exception 50 years ago, I have never missed a vote. And I like to use the term scofflaw voters, just like scofflaw husbands who don't pay their alimony. Scofflaw voters are those that can vote that don't. Now, most of the people you're talking about aren't old enough to vote. But in the Venn diagrams of your subjects, I would put citizen responsibility at the center, with book learning education at one side and experience at the other side. But my question is, we talk a lot about doing things, but how do you instill the sense of responsibility in voters? You can do what Australia did and just require people to go to the polls. You can't require them to vote, but they have to get a ballot, or something more than that. But I really believe the main result we have from our government now is the almost 40% who were eligible but didn't vote in the 2016 elections. So that's why I put responsibility at the front, and the scofflaw voters as responsible for what's happening now, the people that did vote on either side. So,
yeah, I'm curious to get.
Caroline, go ahead. No, go, Scott.
Well, but
I'll talk
the one thing
yeah.
that I wanted to say on that, which I think is interesting from an education perspective, is that I think that we have gotten a little too individualized and personalized in education writ large, and so we lose the collaborative spirit that is necessary for individual responsibility. And so that, I think, from an education perspective, like, one of the things we try to do is try to create that, like, we are in this together. Our success is dependent on all of our success.
Yeah, I think collective success is sort of one of the mantras we try and push forward. The challenge is things have changed a lot in 50 years. And it is, one, difficult to say to a young person, particularly a young person of color, it's your responsibility to vote when the system doesn't work for you, right? And we have to face that reality, because the millennial generation, Generation X, is much more diverse than older generations. And so the motivation, the persuasion to tell them that voting actually matters is very different than it's changed over the years. In addition to that, you have civic education going down. Our system is much more complex, and especially when you talk about registering to vote and actually voting for young people, when you talk about voter ID laws that are systematically made so that young people can't participate in our system, particularly young people of color, it's harder to say it's your responsibility, get over it, and participate in a system that you're inheriting that's already broken. So I just want to put that out there. But it is something I think, because in 2016, quite honestly, and for some people actually made that argument even harder, because you saw in the primary, young people overwhelmingly voted for Bernie. He didn't win in the primary. And then you saw young people overwhelmingly vote for Hillary, and she didn't win, right, even though she won the popular vote. And so having that sense of, I can make a difference, I'm going to vote and keep voting even when you don't feel like you can make a difference, is really hard to get over.
I also wonder if, and I don't think this is something that we've actually done, and I'm sure it's at the back of Scott's mind at some point, is tracking the students that not just actually engage in action civics during their school career, whether it's with us or any other of the wonderful organizations that also do Action Civics, and seeing whether or not they are feeling more responsible and showing up to vote. I wonder if there is a connection there. I would imagine so. I know that there are certain cases and students that I still keep in contact with that I know are just more aware of what's going on and are more apt to take action on things, whether very small or at a little larger scale. So I wonder if there could be a connection to that as well.
I also, there are a group of behavioral scientists that actually studied young people and why they are less likely to vote. And it's not just that they're young, they're new voters. And so without the civic education, without any sort of education of how to participate, and then with increased barriers, they, one, overestimate the process. They feel very uncertain about how the process actually works, like if they actually can make impact. And then two, they really underestimate their political intelligence and knowledge and think, I mean, in some ways, someone might say it's responsible, but that they don't have the expertise to really participate. So that's something also that right. And we actually at Rock the Vote did if you go to our website, we actually analyzed each state and assigned them a report card of how they do with voting laws and election policy and which states promote young people voting and which ones actually don't. It's really sad.
I think the question of research is a good one, right?
Yeah.
What are the things, I mean, if the sort of most basic civic responsibility is to vote, then do these kinds of, whether it's the AP Government and Politics course, whether it's the Service Project, Generation Civics, do any of those actually impact? And I think that that's a terrific research agenda and one that we'll likely undertake.
The last thing I wanted to say on that is this was asked to Senator Graham, I do think that the notion of lowering the voting age to 16 is something that is worth looking at, especially in local elections.
Yeah,
and so I think that that's something where you're seeing Tacoma Park, Hyattsville, and Greenbelt all around here have lowered the voting age. There's an active bill that will be introduced hopefully in the next few weeks in Washington, D.C. We worked on a bill in San Francisco that would do that. And that would give, and talking about research, there are countries around the world that do this. And the voting rates are much higher, not only for young people, but for adults in general. Because if you're able to get young people to vote while they're still in school, while you're able to demystify the voting process, especially in local elections where people, not just young people, but people in the aggregate aren't participating, it would enhance and inspire more civics education. So I do think that's worth thinking about, not as a crazy policy idea, but something that's sensical and would actually enhance civics education as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's even a stepping stone to that, which is allowing pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, which some states do as well.
They're great ideas, and I'll never forget the first time I voted, so I believe that has an impact. We have time for one more question. The young man in the back.
Hello, name is Alexander Hutton. No current affiliations, just recent graduate political science BA. There's a lot of talk, especially within this Q&A, about voting and how it's the most basic civic fundamental right. And short of doing something like Australia, mandatory, at least showing up to the ballot box, the statistics there just don't affirm that voting actually matters. You have a 1 in 60 million chance in being the influential vote in a presidential election. You have a 1 in 10 million chance in being the influential vote in a statewide election. And even just to bring this further, a recent school board election in my hometown of 1,200, not even a single vote would have influenced that. So how do you tie these ideas together when you look at the statistics and they say that voting is something you should partake in, but when the statistics aren't there to back that up, how do you continue to make your argument?
I think Al Gore and Hillary Clinton might disagree with that assessment, but I'm curious what other people think.
So this is exactly the type of argument that you have to, or the challenge that you have to overcome. I think a couple things. One, this is where local elections actually are really important. Because there are fewer people voting and you can actually make a difference with fewer votes, right? I would also say Virginia, the legislature, I don't know if you guys all saw that, obviously, I think you probably all did, 1 vote, right? if you broke down the votes in states like Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania for the presidential election in 2016, and you broke them down by precinct, it comes down to a few votes per precinct. So I think we have to do a better job of showing people how their one vote actually matters, but it does certainly matter.
The one, I haven't seen this in the U.S. presidential election, so it'd be interesting, but we just did sort of a random when Brexit happened, and we sort of, because young people overwhelmingly voted against Brexit, and said, okay, if young people had just voted at the average rate, so the rate of every other demographic, Brexit would not have passed. So that's just like there's the ability to actually change things. And, you know, I mean, yeah, the Virginia legislature is in the hands of Republicans because of one vote. I mean, that's,
right.
You know.
Great. Well, I really want to thank Generation Citizen and Scott and Juanita for being our partners and putting this wonderful event on, and all of our expert panelists for taking time today to share their expertise and thoughts with us, and all of you for coming. I hope you'll continue to push for civics education in all of its forms. Thank you so much.